Herzlich willkommen in der Postmoderne. A very warm welcome to Postmodernity, a map to the present. I'm going to proceed in English now. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our show and its conference. We will have 2 days full of discussions, ideas, questionnaires. We will have a lively discourse between many guests we are very glad to have been inviting, and they're present. So please welcome everybody, and we're very happy that you're joining us online in the audience. We will first start with a quick review what the exhibition is about, how the idea came across, what we meant with the discussion about postmodernism today. It's called A Map for the Present. The big claim of this exhibition is that the present began with postmodernity. That's something the critics have criticized very much. I think it's a big claim, but we will talk about this the next 2 days. I'm very glad that we have discussed and decided for this exhibition because we are in the largest model of it in the Bundeskunsthalle. The Bundeskunsthalle is a children of postmodernism, even though the architect Gustav Peichl has never claimed to be one. He even hated it, as his son Markus Peichl has confirmed. He was the one who has built a big box, 100 by 100 meter, in Bonn, in the former capital of Germany. He has put 3 little funky cones on top, huge cones. And he is the one who has introduced postmodernism to the German architectural audience. It's one of the main iconic buildings we can witness in Germany from its time. We are very proud to have this fantastic architecture to play with, to work with, to exhibit in. And I'm very glad that we have done this project together. Kolja Reichert, my colleague from the Discourse and Studio Bonn, is part of the team, and we have decided that postmodernity is an issue for nowadays, right?
Eva Kraus, the artistic director of Bundeskunsthalle, by the way.
Yes. So, why is postmodernity the subject?
First, because we are in it, in the Bundeskunsthalle. The Bundeskunsthalle has turned 30 last year. We see pictures of the celebration here, a big march down the Aztecian staircase leading to the museum square. Eric de Klerk playing in front of an enthusiastic crowd. And so we did kind of a delayed anniversary exhibition 1 year later, right? 30 years is one generation. One generation gives the chance to have a new glance on what has happened. And it actually shows that a lot of artists, designers, architects nowadays revisit postmodern forms and postmodern programs. And at the same time, postmodernism is very much subject of debate again. We will come to that later. First, another sentence on where we are. Bundeskunsthalle has a public think tank. It's called Studio Bonn. It looks like a talk show. It is a talk show, but it follows certain topics over a series of many events where artists, musicians, scientists gather. Like 2 days ago, Aisha Divi, who we see here, and our colleagues from the UN University. You can see everything on Studio Bonn.io. The conference is also a Studio Bonn.io event.
And our architect, to start with again, is also a cartoonist, a very well-gifted drawer. And he did this fantastic drawing, Quo Vadis, maybe you can read it, Quo Vadis postmodernism. He claims that his funky colleagues are a bit strange. He makes fun of them. He goes for Etare Sotzas, for example, here. And you can see that he's not only a serious architect, but he's also a very funny designer. For example, Charles Moore is the target of his attack, and he goes on and on. Maybe you have seen that in the exhibition.
What was postmodernism? We start the exhibition after you have crossed a space with music videos, with a work by the architect Hans Hollein, which is not architecture, but claims to be architecture. It's the red and blue pill that you know from Matrix, but in one pill, and it's glued to a paper, and it says non-physical environment. This is the threshold to an age where ideas, data, information, creativity become more valuable than material goods. Postmodernism has been canonized as the age also of the simulation. The simulacrum is a figure that Jean Baudrillard wrote a lot about. Every time we talk about digitalization, this very official claim, it also leads back to this pill by Hans Hollein.
And to the antenna of Robert Venturi. He has placed it on top of his guild house, a famous elderly home in the US. And that's kind of one of the starts of postmodernism. We have discussed, of course, in the architecture discourse, it's Dennis Scott Brown and Robert Venturi going to Las Vegas with their students. In this case, we have the simulacrum, we have this symbol of the media and mass media world, which is finally reaching the public, reaching everybody at home. And that is this fantastic golden antenna as an artwork on top of this iconic building.
There was no money for the TV connection, so Venturi decided to make a sculpture that looks like an antenna. So he kind of hid the antenna in a sculpture that is hid in an antenna. And in the metal workshop of Bundeskunsthalle, we recreated the replica. Postmodernism is when media gets out of control. Jacques Derrida explains that we don't really own language. We are not rational subjects that can deal out things with language because language does its own tricks with us. Ronald Reagan was the first actor who actually came into question as a presidential candidate for the Republican Party in 1968. And J.G. Ballard reacted with a very postmodern critique to this. He faked a scientific study about the erotic reactions of people who were exposed to photos of Ronald Reagan.
We also have the claim here, which Paul Feyerabend put into space. It's about anything goes. The idea is about sampling, mixing, high and low, crisscross, everything which you can match, which doesn't match is welcome. I have here a great picture for you from Alchemia. Alchemists are also the ones to make gold out of stone. So that's a bit of the idea what Paul Feyerabend meant. And he said it's about pluralism and the methods can't be wide enough.
Context is a value that gains high currency in the art and architecture and design of the time. Here's an example of James Wines, who is watching from New York today. He's 92 and he couldn't travel, but he will be present tomorrow in a conversation with the artist Simon Denny. We see here his projects for the best department store chain. His biggest collector asked James Wines to create sculptures for his department stores that were spread all across the US. James Wines decided to make the department store itself sculptures, and all the suppressed feelings, affects, anxieties that are actually pushed away by the rational square form of a department store, they themselves become architecture. So it's not about like autonomous objects anymore, about beautiful art that you could put anywhere, but it's about everything in the work paying regard to its surrounding and its history.
And then we have pluralism. The eclectic style goes into fashion. We have this wonderful globalism crisscross. People from the Japan world would come through British tradition into American pop culture, and it's a big mix and match of everything. Fashion is, of course, the world where punk also meets Art Deco, historism, all kinds of different styles, and that's where this fantastic decade becomes very frenetic. It's also the moment when style is on the street. You know, of course, you could wear fantastic outfits, but to bring really the carpet, the red carpet into the streetscape into the clubs and open up new publics. That was the meaning, that was the great moment of fashion.
And there we are with the self as with a very paradox condition in postmodernity. On the one hand, it's being deconstructed by post-structuralism, by Roland Barthes' Death of the Author, by Jacques Derrida. At the same time, the self becomes like the focal point, or like the bottleneck through which politics and everything else and values are mediated. We see Arnold Schwarzenegger posing in the Whitney Museum in an art exhibition. And we see the entrance to our club space, where the heroes of Blitz Club, Studio 54 and Palladium have their gallery. And we are very happy that some regulars of the Blitz Club will be with us just this night.
This is your subject.
Oh, yeah. So, identity politics, bad. That's what we usually hear, because minorities fight each other until there's no society left, right? We look to the origins of of identity politics in the Convery River Collective, a collective of black, mostly lesbian women in Boston, who said that the modernist social movements have failed for them. In socialism, they experienced sexism and racism. In feminism, they also experienced racism. So they were victim of overlaying forms of discrimination. So they said, we have to start with our own identity and with the discrimination that we face to develop an emancipatory politics. And our emancipatory politics could help everyone, because if the weakest subjects in society would be free, everyone would be free. So identity politics is actually good for society, because everybody who understands their own oppression or their own privileges also as a group helps the whole society to better understand how it works. We give out the manifesto of the Convery River Collective for free at request at the box office by the generous okay of one of the authors, Barbara Smith.
And we witness cultural capitalism. The idea is of this chapter to invite you to look back into cultural propaganda, I would even call it. Cultural museums would be the moment of history when, for example, Bilbao was erected or planned. We witness in Frankfurt the Museumsmeile. We have many moments, but also, of course, it all started with the Centre Pompidou. So we have this idea of discussing also today and tomorrow what was culture all about. Culture was the new economy. Culture was also capital. Culture was, of course, also something for society to be informed at. And we will discuss this, that it really made a difference also, of course, in neoliberalism, in all kinds of other forms of politics. But this is part of the exhibition, a very important subject.
Yeah, what does it mean if the idea of economic equality is replaced by the idea of intellectual equality, or a new kind of class warfare is also started by that, which leads us to right-wing populism. This is a meme by Cem A, who runs the most popular art world meme account on Instagram, Freeze Magazine. He will accompany the Congress with memes that will be posted on the Bundeskunsthalle accounts. Why is postmodernism topical again today? Why do we do the show?
We have invited Yukiko for representation. We have invited them to do our catalogue. This is the young generation to explore postmodernism, even they were not born yet. Yukiko is a young studio, and I think this is the reflection of what we do for the symposium, that we have young people, our generation, younger, your generation, to think about the old legends, the history of its time, and so on and so on. So this is what we propose to discuss, that the lifespan between postmodernity and now is about to pick up again and is about to revelate. Can I say this? And then I can leave the floor to the host of the symposium, Kolja Reichert, the head of Studio Bonn, is going to drive you quickly through postmodernism.
Thank you, Eva. But we'll see each other on stage in 5 minutes. So next to the explosion of media that has generated a new obsession again with primary colors, with stark contrasts as we see them here, with unraveling fantasies of forms that show in the work of Studio Yukiko. We also have a very dark present, one could say. It's funny that in the 90s, talk about postmodernism somehow faded. And there was even attempts to call the time Second Modernism, because like the rail tracks in the 19th century that globalized, unified the world, suddenly internet seemed to do the same. Ideas and goods might travel without any blocking and understanding, and capitalism everywhere, which is the thesis of Francis Fukuyama. This hasn't worked out. We see here Simon Denny's installation in the Venice Biennial of 2015, where he takes the graphics from the NSA slides that contained the surveillance program, and he takes all this fantasy imagery and blows it up as installation. Simon Denny very much fits this context part of postmodernism, but in his work we also get a scope of the sublime of the technological power and the concentration in little corporations. We would claim that we are at the end of mass media. That was also something that New Models explained a year ago exactly on that stage at the Congress, The Future of Critique. It's still online. New Models are a duo. Caroline Buster was an art critic for Art Forum, later Texte zur Kunst, and Julian Wadsworth was a musician and a music producer and music video producer. Now they do their completely own platform, which, and this is the fantastic thing, generates judgment, content, ideas from their own community, which is a very different concept of media than it has shaped postmodernism. In Henrike Naumann's work, we see the societal subconscious enter exhibition rooms by used furniture that she finds on eBay wherever she exhibits. And there's also, when you see her installations, you really understand that 30 years have passed. We see like the second Ableitung, like secondary versions of postmodern forms that were dropped in department stores all over, also the GDR, for example, where Henrike grew up. And they become like zombie versions of postmodernism, and thereby Henrike Naumann looks at the ramifications and the social transformations that came after postmodernism. We also see in art a new archaeological interest in the power structures that shaped postmodernism. For example, Noah Barker took the color code of the Centre Pompidou and applied it to the infrastructure wherever this work is exhibited. Noah Barker will be responsible tomorrow for the lectures of Sylvia Levin and Reinhold Martin. So far, a few picks from the program to widen the stakes of the symposium. Postmodernism has reappeared after the election of Donald Trump, and there was a whole genre of essays explaining why Trump is a postmodern president, why postmodernism brought Trump to power. That's wrong, and you can read it in the catalogue, but it's interesting. Also, Alexander Dugin, the Russian philosopher very close to the Kremlin, has talked a lot about postmodernism. And saying, like, if it's true that the meta-narratives are over and there's no truth, we make our own truth, Russian imperialism. At the same time, Russia is very much pushing this idea of the scapegoat of postmodern LGBTQIQ. The postmodern West is something to wage a war again. So it's a very complex relation to postmodern thinking, which was very popular also in the Duma at the start of the century, which Peter Pomerantsev will explain in his talk tomorrow afternoon. Postmodernism also appears increasingly in essays and think pieces. For example, the term the postmodern left, which is allegedly over. It's a term that has come up in right-wing media and blogs and is now something that you can seemingly refer to as if it would be clear what we are actually talking about when we talk about postmodernism. So to end this introduction, we have a photo of the band Visage that emerged from Blitz Club, the origin of the New Romantics movement in the UK, and a strange time window of 2 years where it was possible, for example, to turn Mick Jagger away from the door because he wasn't dressed up. David Bowie showed by and chose his actors for his Ashes to Ashes video. So it was seemingly a time when culture, when self-dressing, could bring you anywhere, which is it still the case today? We doubt it. But we will talk about it tonight at the Blitz Kids panel and tomorrow in the closing panel towards a pluralist ethics. And thereby I would like to ask Eva Kraus back on stage, and with Eva together, a part of the core team that shaped this exhibition by advice, also by generous loans. I'd like to ask Oliver Elser from the Deutsches Architekturmuseum in Frankfurt, who supplied us with numerous incredible architectural models. Please. Gertrud Koch is on screen from Berlin. She is actually ill, but she's still joining us, at least from screen. And Diedrich Diederichsen. Please have a seat.
And we will switch to German.
Jetzt stimmt.
Yes, exactly. We'll switch to German. It's magic. Thank you for joining us. Welcome, Gertrud, also. Gertrud is a leading voice in film science. She's a film scholar and its blind spots. She's done a lot of research on that, especially when it comes to the effect that genderism has on that. She published the magazine Film und Frauen, Film and Women in the 80s. She was a professor for film science at the FU Berlin, and she's also a lecturer at the Yale University. Diedrich Diederichsen
published the book.
Deutsch.
Whoops, I switched into English there. Sorry for that. Diedrich Diederichsen is a leading pop theorist in German language. In the 80s or until the 90s, he was one of the publishers and the chief editors of the magazine Spex, and with it he really shaped the discourse on pop phenomena and fashion, but also art. In the last years, he's been writing more about art than about pop music. Nonetheless, we managed to convince him to write in our catalogue about how pop turned postmodern. Diederichsen teaches at the University of Arts in Vienna, the Universität der Künste. Oliver Elser is an architecture critic. He has been working at the Architectural Museum in Frankfurt for years. He's been curating important exhibitions there, like, for example, processed architectures, and he sort of lay a foundation for that exhibition there. We're going to talk about the postmodernism in Germany. Diedrich, when did you realize postmodernism was in Germany for the first time? When, in 1972 or 1973, I think it was one of those Saturday evenings, and I was there with all my friends who basically all looked the same. They all wore the same clothes, they all had long hair, and they all wore those weird little monkey jackets that people used to wear back then. They wore jeans, just like everybody else, long T-shirts. And, you know, just a typical weekend. We went to the usual club, and our usual dealer sold us some stuff. And that dealer, who, by the way, also looked like us, and he had the longest hair, and his hair was always really sort of greasy. He didn't look too good. He was super skinny, and he had this funny way of walking, like a cartoon by Robert Crumb. he stood there, that dealer, that same place that we always knew where to find him, and he had dyed his hair black. He had gel in his hair, combed back, and he wore a dinner jacket with a velvet parts, and still the same jeans that we all wore. And we asked him, what is happening? What is happening on Earth? We weren't sure whether he was dressed up for carnival, but of course that wasn't it. And we asked him, what are you looking like? Why did you do that? Why did you decide to dress that way? And he said, because I think it's awesome. And that was the first postmodern moment that I experienced myself. However, I didn't understand it back then, because it took me a while until we realized that this, I think his name was Dieter, that he was actually avant-garde by doing something that people later on all did. It turned into a sort of a movement or a cultural period later on. Gertrud, what about you? When did you see postmodernism or understand postmodernism for the first time? I wouldn't say that there was a sort of awakening moment for me and then I understood postmodernism. No, for me it was more of a fluid development. In the late 60s or early 70s, I worked as a music critic. And I was specialized on opera and avant-garde and new music. And within that new music, that was, of course, there was a huge debate on regarding the end of avant-garde, and then it was obvious that something like pop art was about to happen. And when I want to if I want to focus more on the phenomenon, then I'd say, well, it was mainly addressing the issue of pop music, but then, of course, also pop art. I then started working more on film and gave up music critique because I wanted to focus more on film critique. And Warhol's movies were something completely new, something I discovered back then. And I realized, and it was quite obvious, that it shows this transition or this sort of fluid development from modernist avant-garde to pop art. Back then, I wouldn't have called it postmodernism. That is why I tend to speak of postmodern operations. So for me, it's more like operations in terms of how we think and whether it's actually something that happens inside the practice of art, less, related to the events of a certain era. So for me, it's difficult to say, okay, this is when it started happening and then it moved on to a certain time. No, for me, it is more of a very interesting transition, a fluid transition, an overlapping of different art concepts that all were defined and determined by the fact that they had a sort of distance to the canonized art. Does that define postmodern operations, the fact that it's distancing itself from what is established, or can we maybe define postmodern operations in a more detailed way? Well, if you look at the history of arts, then there are ways of defining it. There is this internal distancing from the canon and, of course, also going beyond the canon. Harold Bloom, Anxiety of Influence, everybody does not want to show and talk about whose shoulder they stand on. However, when it comes to pop art, I thought it was astounding. Also, Barbarella, for example, would be a movie that fits it really well. Pardon? Barbarella, you said? Barbarella, yes, exactly. Yes, we're showing that in our exhibition. Yes, because like I said, I was always fascinated by seeing what happens when all those genres, the boundaries between the genres, high arts, low arts, and so on, when that is actually blurred into one. And film, in a way, is the art that sort of broke through these boundaries very early on, that always represented the fact that something can be popular and new at the same time in the spirit of the old avant-garde. And maybe we should actually start by talking about how the link between pop art and postmodernism, what that link is. I think most art historians probably know more about that. Well, we'll see if we have time to talk about that today. If not, I'm sure Simon Denny and James Wines are going to talk about that tomorrow. Oliver Gertrud warns us of actually understanding postmodernism as an era. We take that risk with a playful title, Postmodernity 1967 to 1992. It's almost like, or we pretend that postmodernism can be limited in a way, but our exhibition shows that that's not possible. What is your stance? When did postmodernism start in Germany in architecture, and how was that seen for the first time, and when did it end? Well, when did it start in Germany? I'd say that moment, well, maybe it started in 1970 in Karlsruhe. That moment when there was a competition, an architecture competition. The old town of Karlsruhe was to be renovated, refurbished, and back then it was basically about tearing down the whole center of town and replacing it by something completely new. And that was something that had been done before that in Berlin, in Wedding, for example, Anne-Brunn-Straße. There are these areas that were torn down. Many times that didn't happen in the end, so Kreuzberg was supposed to make place for a motorway. But from the 70s onwards, all of a sudden, people said, no, we'll do it differently. We're not going to do that because this competition leads us to a dead end. So all of a sudden, people decided to maintain the structures that were already there, to rebuild them and to continue with them. So an actual paradigm shift. And the label postmodernism wasn't there back then. That was more related to, the foundation of regional history associations, the environment movement, maybe focusing less on growth. Well, for architecture, but also for the discourse as a whole, the question of, okay, how do we address the past? 1975 is an important year for that. That was a year where all of a sudden people now started to have a positive look at the old times. You know, we're not saying that all of a sudden we wanted to move back to the emperor times, but there was a certain rediscovery of the old structures. And this shift that took place in the early 70s then had a long echo, and this label, postmodernism, is actually only used in hindsight. So when we look at that now, and if I look away from Germany, if I look at the US, then you see that in the 50s, in the 60s, new tendencies in architecture were shown. Playboy architecture, that's what somebody called it. So an architecture that was difficult to capture because it moved away from the old. And he actually was very worried about that. So it wasn't something positive. It was a sort of defense of an old avant-garde against something new that was judged as a step backwards. And all of a sudden, in this field, there were certain trials to label things, and that's when postmodernism was mentioned the first time. In architecture with Just Jenks, so in 1977, the language of postmodern architecture, that's when the breakthrough happened. But it was more of labeling something, a tendency, an attitude that doesn't only exist in architecture, that had been there for a long time, and where I'd say it's not that much of a style, but it's a new way of thinking. But the way how postmodern was copied by Charles Jenks as a notion also shows that postmodernism was also always a marketing term. So something that people used in order to describe something new. If you studied with many experts in postmodernism, postmodernism in Vienna. What was the world in 1990 like, and how did your perspective on postmodernism change through the exhibition? Well, I had an awakening moment, just like you, or very similar. I studied at the Applied University in Vienna, and it was sort of the place to study. People were there from the US, from Italy, Hans Hollein, for example, the maestro, Schule Korb Himmelblau, James Wines, they were all there, Zasta, Mendini, you name it. So the west coast of the US was represented there in Vienna. And I had my moment of awakening when, at a typical meeting, everybody was dressed the same way, black suit, and all of a sudden Vivienne Westwood showed up. She was a professor for fashion back then. She wore a negligee and nothing underneath. And that was the most subversive act I had ever witnessed. And as soon as I saw that, I realized that I, with my conservative Munich background, had to leave that background in order to understand what that world actually means. And so many things happened at that very same time. So much confrontation, deconstructivism was created back then. So in the early 90s in Vienna, there was so much happening, and we really realized that the methods were sort of crashing against each other, the different ideas and also convictions were all encountering each other. And all of that was possible at the same time. This is something that we also emphasize at the exhibition. At least everything was possible, everything at once. All different things were presented. People had those debates, and the multiplication of the different styles, eras, mannerisms, eclecticism, all of that was possible. We have heard very different definitions of postmodernism, or of what we might call postmodernism. Maybe each one of you could give us a definition. Diedrich, you experienced it back then the first time, but when did you actually understand, name postmodernism? Well, there were so many different moments. First of all, I would say that when I hear pop art now, for example, and when I hear people say pop art was already postmodern, and I just had 5 minutes to think about that, and I'd say, well, Roy Lichtenstein was a postmodern artist, but Rosenquist is definitely not. Rosenquist wants to understand how we see things in a given media and cultural architecture in a way that modernists also agreed with. A new world, of course, a different world, but a fully modern project. And that is how this to actually grasp that definition of postmodernism for me is very difficult, especially if you look at the different eras. The moment I described in pop music, well, there were 2, 3, 4 bands, and that's where that dealer guy got the outfit from. So that was the beginning of an era, but these were really individual events, singular events, David Bowie, for example. However, there was a postmodern pop music around the 1980s, from 1980 to 1985, that at a much bigger scale worked as a genre-building institution. So emancipation of quotations, for example, or actually people liking to present themselves as constructed and so on. But these were in singular characters that tried to advance these ideas against the hippies. No, it was actually a mainstream back then. And I think that's something that helps us in order to look at the different arts, the different disciplines, to say, okay, something is coming from a different era that thrived in a certain environment that was already postmodern. And then from case to case, this led to very different phenomena. Well, you always have different phenomena, but different links to different eras. And if we would have done that, and if we would then think of the definitions, the tools we have in terms of definitions in order to understand it, then usually it's quite unreflected to simply say what I just referred to, that emancipation of quotes, or later on a fetishizing the quote, or celebrating the constructed, or also mixing cultures. If I think of movies, for example, the first postmodern mainstream movie is The Apartment by Emilia Kazan, where they really used these methods. But these very different examples that I think, yes, you now would have to look at the detail and see what all of them have in common. But a definition, like I said, when it comes to actually only looking at the era, it already gets difficult. But you mentioned something decisive, the quote, using quotes. So actually showing and using the quote as a quote. And against that backdrop, I'd like to ask Gertrud and challenge her. Warhol, for example, who the soup cans, the economy of attention, he declared that as an art subject, and that's a radical step. But what is more radical is the step where Warhol was copied, Warhol Flowers by Ivan Störtebeck.
Yes, indeed. In a way, this is a sort of new chapter, we might say. And it also occurs in the world of film, where from a technical point of view, well, we could also discuss about the role which technology has to play in these transitions. And film is a medium where it's quite easy to quote something. For instance, I can insert something in a film, which then later on, that is what would also happen in music, that is several quotes are also inserted into discs, records, so to speak. And all these are techniques which already operate with reproduction methods. And perhaps this thing of postmodernism, if we want to understand it as a noun, which I tried not to do, then we should also put it into this context. Is this, or are these, so to speak, also paraphrases of Benjamin's essay about the role of the art and the age of reproducibility? Because this possibility to quote presupposes that you have some tangible objects. And what actually makes it possible to quote something, to use something as a quote? When can I say that inserting this in films, in music? I would be interested in this, whether there are still any connections which we are not discussing about, or which we are discussing about separately in media theory or philosophy, but which we do not get together with the cultural developments of, so to speak, in our real-life world, and the expression in this fusing of technology, art and culture and lifestyles. Could you perhaps say that there are new methods of reproduction? There is a new type of lifestyle, and there are many new magazines, and this is why all of a sudden furniture, beds are becoming boxing rings, and furniture is made for the magazine, not for the living room. So could there be a relation between the media and postmodernism? I would never say that there is a single cause, but I'm interested in the interaction of these. So in particular in music, for instance, we need this distribution technology, because otherwise such fan communities couldn't form, which also use clothing, for instance, for clothing for sort of pop-up imitations as a sort of social game. There are some preconditions which you need for this, and just a live performance isn't enough. And the closeness, well, I was fascinated by the following. A PhD student who did some work about technology found these old Olivetti ads, and it was quite interesting that the typewriter, the travel typewriter from Olivetti, was advertised for with pop music in the background, with some dance performance in the squares of Milan. Do you know the red Olivetti typewriter? Do you mean that? Yeah. And as far as I'm concerned, this was a sudden understanding of the simultaneity, that is the technical modality in the consumer product. This also accelerated a sort of everyday life aestheticism, and it could be propagated faster than before. So this interaction, so to speak. And then, well, Warhol is a very soft example of advertising and object and the fetishization of the object, which has this, or sets into motion this magical power of reproduction. And this also anticipates, in a way, fan cultures. This almost brings us to the presentation by Diedrich Diederichsen on style at 6 o'clock today. And I would like to place the focus on postmodernism in Germany. Ralph Martin from the Columbia University, who will be speaking to us, said in the exhibition that in Germany, actually, we have the best postmodern architecture because the business culture was different, and there were then actually public customers who used postmodern architects. Would you confirm this, that we have the best postmodern architecture in Germany? And if so, what is so special about this spread of postmodern architecture in Germany? What you can also see in the exhibition are the examples from Japan. Japan is also a postmodern country. Italy, with Alfredo Gualdetti, has this culture. France has it. In the exhibition, there is, for instance, Abraxas. The film was a scene, a set for the Hunger Games. And so I think Germany is not that special in this respect. But in Germany, this is related to museum building and also a new design of cities. And then something like the IBA in Berlin might come about. And in particular, these museums stand for a rethinking of a cultural concept, a cultural notion. And we have to bear in mind that what we celebrate as a success story, the Frankfurt Museum riverbank, was actually seen as a neoliberal backlash. So at that time, it wasn't seen as a future-oriented new mode of thinking. It wasn't really welcomed. And Kunsthandwerk, cultural craft by Richard Meyer, is a sort of Le Corbusier zombie. The Schirm Museum, with its sandstone cladding and the columns, is rather a sort of crypto-Nazi architecture, like by Speer. And the Architectural Association said, well, actually, you are doing rubbish because this is culture only for elites. You must also make utilitarian buildings, and you're now investing all the money in these few lighthouse projects. So it's something else. When I look at this from the current point of view, and today I can see the difference from what had been there before. For that reason, I think it's interesting, and I do appreciate the energy to design something of your own. But when you go back to this time, you should also realize that this was very suspect from the political point of view. And the epitome of reactionary is the capital of our house, this exhibition dating back to 1980, and also the Venice Biennale. And there is Jonathan Smith, who always said that he designed as if modernism had never existed. And Heinrich Glotz, the founding director of your museum, Museum, right, exactly, thinks this is very interesting in abstract terms. But there was this claim, and when I look at the old drawings on this portal, then it's hardly surprising that Thomas Goldschmidt at the Catholic ended up at the Catholic University of Notre Dame. And he followed up to Trappism in architecture. And these are things which we should also take into account. And when did this begin to be re-evaluated? When was it seen as a remnant of a past period, and how would you now assess the postmodern architecture in Germany? I'm not quite sure whether this re-evaluation is already taking place. It's now, in a way, in a sort of retro nostalgia when you're saying, oh yeah, we are still in this generation of the golf car drivers. And then among the younger architects, it's a phase where they actually do what at that time was at the top of the agenda, that is, anything goes, and not variety. And, well, this phase didn't last long. And nowadays, when I look at what the generation between 30 and 40 is designing, well, this is anything but suspicious or suspect, and they do what they want, and they are not being put into question for this. Eva, postmodernism in Germany, was it good or not? I think Germany had big problems with postmodernism. It was not really on the agenda. There was the great modesty which was being advocated, in particular in architecture after 1945, and the horizontal modernism as the Chancellor's bungalow next door here. That is, this simplicity, this reduction, this was important. And this is why it never took wing in Germany. And we don't have the sense of humor for this. We don't have this mental distance. We cannot laugh about ourselves or not take things so seriously. And this is the reason for this objection to postmodernism. Nobody appreciates it, but they don't want to criticize this because there is energy in this. And I think that Germany missed out on postmodernism in Germany. Well, pop music, counterculture. I would say that in these areas, people never wanted to be German in the first place, and they never had a culture of remembering, but they tried to hide away their Germanness, so to speak, although krautrock is now also flourishing. And there was a period which you might call postmodern, when there was an ironic reference to Germany. But this was not a reference to Germany with its past, but the German Federal Republic, so a sort of embarrassing or perhaps a caricature of the culture in Germany, which developed about in the 80s and which came up then. The Neue Deutsche Welle, the new German wave. Well, there was a poster which said, if you don't like punk, go to the GDR. And this is a perfect final statement. We will be meeting again in 15 minutes' time for the presentation by Henrike Naumann about postmodernism and what developed after it. Thanks a lot, Eva, Gertrud, Diedrich, and Oliver.